Hi. Thank you for sticking around attending this presentation. Note to self: do not follow Meltem on any presentations in the future. Too good-looking, too entertaining, too bubbly, too many nice slides. It's very difficult to do. This is my slide. That's it. So don't get too excited. I am chairman of Global Advisors Holdings Limited. It is one of the largest digital asset platforms in the world. If you haven't heard the name Global Advisors, you may have heard the name Gabi, or Global Advisors Bitcoin Investment Fund, or XBT Provider, or XIJ, or Aventus, or Glint, or Itineris, and so on. We have a large number of interests in our portfolio, the good news is around $1 billion. The bad news, it was about $1.5 billion a week ago, but it's coming back. It's coming back. I'll tell you for a second, I think the reason it's coming back is, having been to a number of Bitcoin conferences over the last few years, what is quite obvious at the moment is we have a lot of happy people here. And I think part of the reason we do is a lot of the legacy incumbents in Bitcoin have taken some profits in the last quarter, and particularly the last month of last year. And therefore a 30 or 40% drop doesn't seem to be as animating and depressing for them as it might have been at some times in the past. And I actually think there's a lot of cash on the sideline waiting to come into cryptocurrency at the moment. And I think we're seeing that bottoming out right now. That's just my personal tip for the day. So I'm going to talk about escape velocity. 1959, the Russian Space Agency sent an unmanned probe into space, and its objective was to crash land onto the face of the moon and send back all kinds of interesting information. But despite the fact that the moon is a very large target, the Russians missed with this endeavor. And Luna 1 was the first man-made vessel to ever reach escape velocity. That's 11.2 kilometers a second. It escaped a geocentric orbit and is now orbiting the sun. And in an analogy that's often made in crypto, my Bitcoin journey began with very humble beginnings, when in 2012 I sent $10,000 of my own money to the Agricultural Bank of Shenzhou in China, never thinking I would see that money again. But fortunately for me, it came back in the form of quite a few Bitcoins at that time, and I began to experiment. So I began to experiment with a blockchain, I began to experiment with wallets, and two things started to jump into my head immediately. One, how does this infrastructure technically work? How does a blockchain work? And that was an interesting experiment for me. I had to dust off a few old math textbooks, and it struck me, this thing's just a beautiful network, and it's an incredible invention. And like a lot of great inventions, it actually was not completely original. It actually stood on the shoulders of a bunch of other smart guys who created all of the building blocks that turned into Satoshi Nakamoto's brilliant discovery. Secondly, what is money? And we all know what the definition of money is: a store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and we know the characteristics of good money: fungibility, non-forgeability, transportability, durability, and so on. And if you look at the sort of forms of money that we have, and you see gold and you see dollars, you realize how they fit into these categories. And when you look at Bitcoin in this same metric, you realize it's an exceptionally good form of money. And that all that matters when it comes to money is a sense of community. And I think you'll sense, and I sense from a very early stage, Bitcoin has this tremendous sense of community. So I dove in, and I fell into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, as so many people do. And I endeavored really hard to get the regulators in my home jurisdiction in the Channel Islands in Jersey to accept my new idea of a regulated Bitcoin fund, which they thought I was absolutely bonkers to do. But after a year and a half, we managed to do that. And so we launched in 2014, September, we launched Gabi. It was a groundbreaking product at the time. And it had put Bitcoin, I believe, sort of into a really legitimate framework, and was trying to extract the great benefits of Bitcoin from what had been a very murky history at that point. So we launched Gabi to great excitement. We put some of our own money in. We had a few founding investors. And then we found out something very interesting. Nobody gave a shit. And so, we went on for the next 2 years. I traveled to 65 cities in 15 countries and did nearly 400,000 miles, and it was kind of tough sledding. And there were two fundamental problems. One, Jamie Dimon. You can say boo whenever I say Jamie Dimon. And Jamie told everyone, quote, Bitcoin as a currency is going nowhere. That was one problem. And the second problem we had, which seemed to be pervasive at the time, those of you who know me will know that my ex-wife, Blythe, went in the private blockchain route with digital asset holdings. And the prevailing thought at the time was that, you know what, these private blockchains are great. We don't need that horrible Bitcoin stuff. You had the C3s and the DAHs of the world, and you had even companies like Circle that were Bitcoin pioneers pivoting away from Bitcoin and all going sort of under the radar in these private networks. So this was very, very hard sledding for us for quite some time, until something interesting happened. Pause. Ethereum. So Ethereum came along, and the duality of Ethereum and Bitcoin seemed to be a more powerful combination than Bitcoin alone. Ethereum, all of a sudden, started to look like a disruptive force for the stock market. So you had Bitcoin disrupting fiat money and gold, and you had Ethereum as an alternative to the stock market. And the effectiveness of Ethereum as a disruptor for the stock market didn't become apparent to me until we did our first ICO. We had a portfolio company called Aventus Systems. I say company, it was two students that we recruited from Imperial College London, 21 and 22 years old respectively. They're now 23 and 24 years old respectively, and they have a $100 million company. So, this doesn't happen any other way but for an ICO. They were great developers, they had a great idea, it was a blockchain-specific idea, it was unforkable into a free version. 4 things everyone should remember when they're looking at an ICO. And this was a wonderful thing. I got to understand very quickly, early last year, why ICOs are important. And they're important, I think, for one really, really fundamental reason. A good ICO is a trial in the public domain by 8,000 computer scientists and your peers who will roast you and tell you if your idea is a good idea. And if you want one tip for what ICOs to invest in going forward, check Discord, check Twitter, check Reddit, check whichever social media platform you care to list, and make sure that the people behind your ICO are developing a tremendous community of their peers who will evaluate this project and tear it to pieces prior to the ICO. People will buy it regardless, whether it's good or bad, but the good ones go through this trial of fire, and it's a wonderful thing to see. I personally think that this kind of a process, although it's chaotic and it has all kinds of regulatory and statutory holes in it, no shortage of examples of that I'm sure you've heard this week and before. But what a wonderful thing to happen, because I'm going to take a lot more comfort that 8,000 computer scientists evaluated this project than that I got a nice prospectus from the SEC telling me 50,000 ways I can lose my money that really don't mean anything. So ICOs, a wonderful thing if done correctly. So we'd already made this big kind of move forward. Here we have this new emerging digital asset economy or digital financial services industry, where you have Bitcoin, you have as a reserve currency, if you can call it that. You have Ethereum as an execution currency. And then you have a third layer where you have these new equity or debt or bond or network-like tokens, however you want to categorize them. And we had the makings of a new universe. So what are the issues that go with this? Why does this universe, which seems to be so much more interesting, not sort of thrive in an even bigger way than it has? And I think it's a little bit like the Uber effect. So Uber have a better mousetrap than anybody else with a taxi. I mean, that's just a fact. We all use it. We travel around the world. We get out of an airport. We don't speak the language. We don't have the currency. You get in an Uber. It takes you where you want to go. Fantastic. Uber were banned from my home city, London. And they were banned because they didn't conform to the rules. They didn't do the right checks on the drivers. They didn't have the right insurance. They didn't have the right cabs and all this stuff. So the mayor of London banned Uber. Now, the mayor of London was elected by 200,000 vote majority. Within 24 hours, 1 million people had put in a petition saying they did not want Uber to be banned. In other words, the mayor was gone if he didn't reverse this decision, and it was subsequently reversed. And I feel a little bit like this digital asset economy and universe is that Uber moment. We have a better mousetrap. If two 20-year-olds can make a great $100 million tech company in 6 months, and it's legitimate, there is something really virtuous about this, but it cuts across every rule. And that, I think, is sort of where we are. Now, what are the forces that we are dealing with? You know, what are the forces of the legacy, or as I call it, analog financial services industry? We have some very powerful ones. My company is regulated in 7 countries. And I can tell you things like the European AML, or Anti-Money Laundering Directive number 5, has already started talking about steps that the EU wants to implement in terms of anti-money laundering for cryptocurrency. If it were to be implemented, it would be in the AML 6 legislation, which will be published in 2018 and effective 2019. And the draft I have seen would, if implemented, attempt to ban every cryptocurrency in the world. It is an attempt to identify and put a name on every single wallet and every single transaction, you know, an event which is completely counter to the ethos of cryptocurrencies. That's one of the gravitational forces that we fight. Another one, for the literary scholars amongst you. So Tolstoy, War and Peace. Anyone know how many pages, roughly? 1,000 pages. One Litecoin to the man that said that. So 1,000 pages. Bleak House, Charles Dickens, 1,200 pages. The Dodd-Frank Act, a large piece of post-financial crash legislation, 848 pages. MiFID II came out on January the 3rd this year. My company, through the XBT platform, our largest platform, this has got over $1 billion in it alone, is subject to all the MiFID II regulations because we trade on a regulated market. The MiFID II legislation ran to 7,000 pages. And all I can tell you is that when we started trading, and a lot of our counterparts in the exchange-traded note business started trading on January the 3rd this year, half the exchanges in Europe went down because they just didn't know how to comply with all the stuff that had been put in place, and the files that were supposed to be read with all the risk warnings and the disclaimers couldn't be read, and none of it made any sense, and everything kind of crashed. And I mean, what are we trying to do here? It is just a massive, massive ball of knots. It is a dysfunctional system. So all along in my sort of Bitcoin and digital asset journey, I've been trying to figure out, having come from the analog world, how does the analog world relate to the digital world? Are we going to learn from each other? Are we going to merge? Is there going to be some symbiosis between the two? You know, do we take best practices from both sides? And I'm coming to the conclusion rapidly that there will be no merger, there will be no cooperation, there will be no symbiosis. That this we're going to rule on Bitcoin, or we're going to tell you what you can do, actually may not happen. And that in fact, our universe may move off in a direction on its own. Now, what do I see within that universe today that parallels the old universe? I see, firstly, a tremendous wealth effect. I see people who've made a lot of money in digital assets, they want to stay in digital assets. This is where the buyers for ICOs and for tokens and for asset coins come from. People make money in Bitcoin and Ethereum. We've generated $700 billion of wealth in the last 4 or 5 years. It's all accrued to individuals since there are very few institutions in this space. And that wealth recirculates. So you have this tremendous wealth effect. People would rather buy some crappy ICO coin than take their money back to fiat. That's how strong this community is. Second thing, we've seen corporate restructuring. I was involved as a large shareholder for a company that went bankrupt. I lost all my money in the analog space. Company went bankrupt with $45 million in cash. That was 50 cents a share. I paid $1 for the shares. The lawyers ate the lot. You know what? When Bitfinex went bust in June of 2015, 16, they restructured with a digital token. And as a person who lost in that near bankruptcy, I got 100% recovery with no cost. We had the best bankruptcy restructuring in the history of bankruptcies done with digital tokens. We've now got investment analysis. You know, people are starting to look intelligently. My company, through a Coinshares brand, you'll be seeing a bunch of research rolling out on this site. We've started to actually do real deep dive research. We've done an overarching Bitcoin piece, an overarching Ethereum piece, and we're going to be rolling out a whole sort of new coin review, multi-currency review soon. Really high quality stuff, and it makes sense. We're seeing collateralized lending. A company called Salt. If you don't own their tokens, I recommend it. We bought them at 75 cents. Even after this dump there at $9, I think, they hit 17, I think, a week or two ago. This company's got a very simple premise. They will lend you money, cash, dollars, based on your crypto portfolio. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because most crypto millionaires don't want to sell their crypto because they've made a lot of money on it, they want to keep it, and they want to keep making money on it. So this company will mortgage your crypto for you. And they've done exceptionally well. That's a real business. So this is another aspect. And one of my final aspects I find the most interesting is after we did this successful ICO, we raised around $30 million at that moment. You know, this ICO process was incredibly stressful. It was like childbirth. I've never birthed a child, obviously, but I've been around it. And it's a sort of very hard work. It's a lot of stress. And you don't think about anything else until the baby is born. Well, in an ICO, it's the same thing. And as soon as our baby ICO was born, we went, oh my God, what are we going to do with this 30 million bucks? You know, we're long a lot of Ethereum now. And you know, I've seen people that have sold companies, that have gone public, people that have become wealthy for whatever reason. And usually when that happens, Goldman Sachs knock on the door and they say, hi, Goldman Sachs here, can I manage your wealth? No one does this in crypto. You know, if you add up the treasury value of the ICOs that have been done, particularly now when some of the more aging ICOs have had the benefit of the upswing in crypto, there are billions of dollars of treasury assets sitting out there in ICOs. And my company is starting a new product line which is going to offer bespoke investment management services to the treasuries and the foundations behind these ICOs. So one thing after another, I see this these functions that I knew and loved in the analog financial services industry being replicated, often without competition, but being replicated in a way that whether it's issuing equity, issuing debt, collateralized lending, restructuring, bankruptcy, or treasury management, it's being done in a more efficient and a more elegant and a really super technological way. And it's on that basis that my premise going forward over the next year or two is that we're not going to remake or untie this ball of knots, which is the analog financial system. We are going to replace it wholesale. That's my belief. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.